Hello! Get ready for a fascinating journey into the heart of American history. Today, we're going to delve into the depths of a document that not only shaped a nation, but also inspired freedom movements around the world, the 1776 United States Declaration of Independence. But don't worry, this won't be a boring history lesson. We'll bring to life the heroes, the heated debates, and the courageous decisions that culminated in that pivotal summer. Get ready to discover surprising details, little-known curiosities, and feel the emotion of that historic moment. Stay with us, for this is the story of your freedom, of our freedom, written with the boldness of men who dared to dream of a different world. The seeds of revolution imaging 18th century America. Not the vibrant metropolises we know today, but a patchwork of 13 colonies, each with its own identity, but all under the yoke of the distant British crown. For more than a century, these colonies had prospered, developing their economies, their cultures, and, crucially, growing sense of autonomy. But this initially symbiotic relationship began to deteriorate under the weight of British policies that the colonists considered unfair and oppressive. Let's go back a little to understand how these seeds of revolution were planted. After the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, Britain emerged victorious, but also deeply in debt. To replenish its coffers, the British Parliament began imposing a series of taxes on the American colonies, arguing that they should bear part of the costs of their own defense. Here we find the crux of the contention: no taxation without representation. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament, and so argued that they should not be subjected to taxes imposed by a legislature in which they had no say. Laws such as the Sugar Act 1764, the Stamp Act 1765, and the Townshend Acts 1767 were met with increasing resistance. Imagine the outrage of an ordinary colonist, a farmer in Virginia or a merchant in Boston, when told that he now had to pay taxes on everything from newspapers and legal documents to glass and tea. It was as if a stranger had come into his home and started dictating how he should spend his own money. The Stamp Act in particular provoked a widespread backlash. It required most printed materials, including newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and legal documents, to be produced on taxed and stamped paper. This directly affected people of all social classes and professions, from lawyers and journalists to tavern keepers and card players. The outrage was so great that it led to the formation of groups such as the Sons of Liberty, secret organizations that used intimidation and protest tactics to oppose British laws. One of the prominent leaders of this movement was Samuel Adams, a tireless agitator from Boston. Adams, with his fiery rhetoric and ability to mobilize public opinion, played a crucial role in the growing resistance. He argued passionately that the colonists were British subjects with the same rights as the inhabitants of Great Britain, and that these rights were being flagrantly violated. The colonists' response was not limited to words. Boycotts of British goods became common, causing significant losses to British merchants and pressuring Parliament to reconsider its policies. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed in 1766, a victory for the colonists, but it did not resolve the fundamental issue of taxation without representation. Tensions rose again with the Townshend Acts, which imposed taxes on a variety of imported goods. The colonists responded with yet another wave of boycotts and protests. In Boston, the situation became particularly volatile, culminating in the Boston Massacre of 1770, when British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of protesters, killing 5 people. Although the event was used as propaganda by colonial leaders to further inflame anti-British sentiment, it also exposed the growing hostility between the colonists and the British authorities. A brief period of relative calm followed the repeal of most of the Townshend Acts, except for the tea tax. However, this peace would be short-lived. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly over the tea trade in the American colonies, and allowed it to sell tea at a lower price than colonial merchants, even with the tax included. Despite the lower price, The colonists saw the Tea Act as a ploy to get them to accept the principle of taxation imposed by Parliament. The response was dramatic. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans raided 3 British ships anchored in Boston Harbor and threw entire cargoes of tea overboard. This event, which became known as the Boston Tea Party, marked a turning point in the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. The British government responded with a series of punitive measures known as the Intolerable Acts or Coercive Acts. These laws included closing the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for, amending the Massachusetts Charter to reduce the power of the colonial government and increase the authority of the Crown-appointed governor, allowing British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies, and passing a new Quartering Act, which allowed British troops to be quartered in colonists' private homes, even without the consent of their owners. These laws, rather than intimidating the colonists, only strengthened their resolve and united the 13 colonies in a common cause. The idea that Britain was determined to crush their liberties spread quickly. Representatives from 12 colonies. Georgia did not initially participate. Met at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September 1774 to discuss a unified response to British actions. At the Congress, the delegates approved a declaration of rights and grievances, appealing to the king to remedy their grievances. They also voted to boycott all British goods and formed local associations to enforce it. Most importantly, they agreed to reconvene the following year if their grievances were not met. While the delegates debated and petitioned, the situation on the ground deteriorated. In Massachusetts, the colonists began to organize and form militias, known as Minutemen, ready to fight at the slightest warning. The British, in turn, reinforced their military presence in Boston. The spark that ignited the revolution occurred in the early morning hours of April 19, 1775. British troops were sent from Boston to Concord to confiscate arms and ammunition stored by the colonists and to arrest radical leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Paul Revere and other horsemen rode through the night, warning the colonial communities of the approaching British. In the village of Lexington, the British found a group of militiamen waiting for them in the town square. It is not known who fired the first shot, but the result was a brief but bloody exchange of gunfire that left 8 colonists dead. The British moved on to Concord, where they encountered even greater resistance, forced to retreat to Boston under constant fire from colonial militiamen hiding behind stone walls and trees. The British troops suffered heavy casualties. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the American War of Independence. From that moment on, the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain ceased to be merely a political dispute and became an armed struggle for freedom. The March to Independence followed the clashes at Lexington and Concord. The situation evolved rapidly. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in May 1775, with delegates from all 13 colonies present. Initially, many delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Great Britain. They were not necessarily seeking independence, but rather a just resolution of their grievances and a restoration of their rights as British subjects. However, events on the battlefield were pushing the colonies toward a point of no return. In June 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill, actually fought at Breed's Hill, near Boston, took place. The colonial forces, although eventually forced to retreat due to lack of ammunition, inflicted heavy casualties on the British, demonstrating their determination and ability to fight. The battle had a profound impact on public opinion in both America and Great Britain, signaling that this would not be an easy conflict for the British. The Continental Congress took important steps, including the creation of the Continental Army and the appointment of George Washington, a prominent Virginian with military experience, as its commander-in-chief. Washington's selection was strategic, as it helped unite the northern and southern colonies in common cause. Despite growing hostility and preparations for war, many colonists were still hesitant to embrace the idea of full independence. Their was a strong sense of loyalty to the British Crown and apprehension about the uncertainties that independence would bring. Some feared political instability, prolonged war, and the potential economic consequences of separation from Great Britain, which was the world's greatest trading power at the time. However, throughout 1775 and early 1776, a number of factors began to shift public opinion toward independence. King George III's refusal to respond to congressional petitions and his proclamation that the colonies were in rebellion hardened the positions of many colonists. The deployment of more British troops and mercenaries to America also fueled anti-British sentiment. A pivotal moment in this shift in sentiment was the publication in January 1776 of a fiery and persuasive pamphlet entitled Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, an English immigrant who had recently arrived in America. In clear, straightforward language, Paine argued that the idea of a small island ruling a vast continent was absurd and contrary to common sense. He attacked hereditary monarchy and advocated the creation of a republican government in America. Common Sense became an instant success, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and being widely read and discussed throughout the colonies. Its powerful rhetoric and rational arguments convinced many undecided colonists of the need for and feasibility of independence. Paine not only criticized Britain, but also presented an inspiring vision of an independent America, free to govern itself and pursue its own interests. As public opinion moved toward independence, the Continental Congress continued to debate the issue. There was a conservative faction that still hoped for reconciliation, while a more radical faction advocated immediate secession. Leaders such as John Adams of Massachusetts were prominent voices in this movement for independence. In June 1776, Congress finally began to formally debate the issue of independence. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution stating that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. Lee's resolution was a crucial step, but Congress knew it needed a more formal and elaborate statement to justify its decision to the world. It was then that a 5-man committee was appointed to draft a Declaration of Independence. This committee included some of the most influential members of Congress: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Although all members of the committee contributed to the process, the primary task of drafting the document fell to Thomas Jefferson, young and eloquent delegate from Virginia. Jefferson was known for his writing skills and his Enlightenment ideas on natural rights and government. Jefferson retired to his room and worked on the Declaration over the course of several days. He drew on Enlightenment ideas, particularly those of John Locke, who advocated the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson adapted these ideas, replacing property with the pursuit of happiness, a phrase that would resonate deeply with the American spirit of optimism and opportunity. Jefferson's initial draft underwent revisions by committee and later debate and amendments in the Continental Congress itself. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin made important suggestions to refine the language and strengthen the arguments. One of the most controversial points in Jefferson's initial draft was a lengthy indictment of King George III for promoting the slave trade and inciting slave uprisings in the colonies. This passage was eventually removed by Congress, partly because of objections from delegates from southern colonies, whose economies depended on slavery, and partly because of concerns about the unity of the colonies. The removal of this clause is a painful reminder of the contradictions and hypocrisies at the founding of America, where the pursuit of freedom for some coexisted with slavery for many others. The birth of a nation. Finally, on July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted in favor of Richard Henry Lee's resolution of independence. The vote was not unanimous. Some delegates were still hesitant, and the New York delegation abstained. awaiting instructions from their provincial assembly. However, the majority voted to secede from Great Britain. With the decision for independence made, attention turned to the declaration itself. Over 2 days of intense debate, the delegates revised and amended Jefferson's text. Minor changes were made to the wording to make it more precise and persuasive. Finally, on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was formally approved by the Continental Congress. This date would become a landmark in American history, celebrated annually as Independence Day. The Declaration begins with an eloquent preamble that sets forth the philosophical principles that justified the colonies' decision to secede from Great Britain. The opening words are some of the most famous and inspiring in history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This bold declaration of natural rights and equality was revolutionary for its time. While the application of these principles was incomplete and flawed from the beginning, particularly with regard to slavery and the rights of women and Native Americans, they established an ideal toward which America would continue to strive throughout its history. Following the preamble, the Declaration presents a long list of specific grievances against King George III and the British government. These grievances detail the actions that the colonists considered tyrannical and that justified their decision to rebel. The list includes charges such as imposing taxes without consent, maintaining standing armies in peacetime without the consent of the colonial legislatures, obstructing the administration of justice in the colonies, restricting colonial trade, and declaring war against the colonists. Each complaint is carefully crafted to present a clear case of abuse of power by Britain and to demonstrate that the colonists had made every reasonable effort to seek a peaceful reconciliation before resorting to independence. The language is strong and accusatory, painting the king as a tyrant who was determined to subjugate the colonies. The declaration culminates with a bold assertion of independence. Wherefore, we, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And in support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we do mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This final declaration was not only a proclamation of political independence, but also a solemn oath among the delegates. As they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, they were aware of the enormous risks they were taking. If the revolution failed, they would be branded traitors and would face the ultimate punishment. After the declaration was approved on July 4th, it was printed and distributed throughout the colonies. On July 8th, it was read publicly in Independence Square in Philadelphia to an enthusiastic crowd. The reading of the Declaration marked a moment of great celebration and emotion, but also of solemn recognition of the struggle that lay ahead. The Declaration of Independence not only justified the colony's separation from Great Britain, but also established the founding principles of the new American nation: popular sovereignty, natural rights, and self-government. These ideals would go on to shape the history of the United States and inspire movements for freedom and democracy throughout the world. It is important to remember that at the time the Declaration was adopted, the War of Independence was already underway. The Declaration did not cause the war, but it did provide a moral and political justification for the struggle. The colonists were now fighting not only against unjust policies, but for their own freedom and the right to self-government. The formal Signing of the Declaration took place on August 2, 1776. Most of the 56 signatories were men of means and education, many of whom had played leadership roles in their respective colonies. By signing the document, they were putting their lives and fortunes on the line. As Benjamin Franklin is reported to have said, "We must all hang together, or we shall all surely hang separately." Among the best-known signatories were John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, whose large and elaborate signature became famous; Samuel Adams, the Boston agitator; John Adams, the eloquent advocate of independence; and Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence was an act of great courage and daring. It represented a radical break with the past and the launch of a new nation based on ideals of liberty and equality. However, the road to independence would be long and arduous, marked by years of war, sacrifices, and uncertainty. Beyond words, the fight for independence, the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, did not signal the end of the struggle, but rather the beginning of a long and challenging war for the survival of the new nation. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, suffered a series of initial defeats against the well-trained and well-equipped British Army. The early years of the war were difficult for the Americans. Battles such as the Battle of Long Island in 1776 resulted in heavy losses for the colonial forces, and Washington himself was forced to make strategic retreats to avoid the complete destruction of his army. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, was particularly brutal, with American soldiers suffering from lack of supplies, food, and clothing, and many dying from disease and exposure. Nevertheless, the determination of the colonists and Washington's leadership kept the cause of independence alive. Crucial victories, such as the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, which convinced France to enter the war as an ally of the Americans, changed the course of the conflict. French aid, which included financial support, troops, and naval power, was critical to the eventual American victory. The war dragged on for more than 8 years, with battles fought in various parts of the colonies. The Americans, despite their disadvantages in terms of training and resources, fought tenaciously, driven by the conviction that they were fighting for their freedom and the future of their nation. In addition to the fighting on the battlefield, the struggle for independence was also fought in the realm of diplomacy and public opinion. Benjamin Franklin played a crucial role as the American envoy to France, where his skill and charm helped secure French support for the American cause. The Declaration of Independence, with its powerful language about rights and freedom, served as a beacon for Americans and a message to the world about the ideals at stake in the war. It helped unite the colonists in a common cause and garner international support for their struggle. Interestingly, not all colonists supported independence. A significant portion of the population, known as Loyalists or Tories, remained loyal to the British Crown. The Civil War within the American Revolution led to deep divisions in communities and even families. Furthermore, the Declaration of Independence, despite its proclamation of equality, did not extend to all inhabitants of the colonies. Slavery continued to exist, and the rights of women and Native Americans were largely ignored. These contradictions cast a shadow over the nation's founding ideals and would lead to later struggles for equality and justice. Nevertheless, the Declaration of Independence remains a foundational document in the history of human rights. Its assertion that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights inspired movements for freedom and democracy in the world. Figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. cited the Declaration as a source of inspiration in their own struggles for justice and equality. The Revolutionary War ended in 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, in which Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The new nation now faced the challenge of building a government that embodied the ideals expressed in the Declaration. The legacy of the Declaration: after gaining independence, the United States faced the challenge of establishing a lasting and just government. The Articles of Confederation, The first system of government adopted by the 13 colonies proved inadequate, leading to a period of instability and economic hardship. In 1787, leaders from across the nation met at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. The debates were heated, with different factions advocating different models of government. However, the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, with its emphasis on individual rights and popular sovereignty, permeated the discussions. The United States Constitution, ratified in 1788, established a federal system of government with the separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and a system of checks and balances to prevent the concentration of power. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, added in 1791, guaranteed a number of fundamental rights to citizens, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, and protection from unlawful searches and seizures. The Declaration of Independence, while not a legally binding document like the Constitution, remains a foundational statement of American values and principles. It serves as a constant inspiration for the pursuit of freedom, equality, and justice in America and around the world. Throughout American history, the Declaration has been invoked at crucial moments to justify the expansion of civil rights and the fight against oppression. Abraham Lincoln cited the Declaration in his speeches on slavery, arguing that the statement, that all men are created equal, applied to all human beings. The civil rights movement of the 1960s used the language of the Declaration to demand equality for African Americans. The legacy of the Declaration of Independence also extends beyond the borders of the United States. It has inspired countless independence movements and democratic reforms around the world. Its central idea that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed has been a powerful driving force in the pursuit of self-determination and freedom in many nations. Yet, the ideal of equality proclaimed in the Declaration remains an aspiration in many ways. Racial, social, and economic inequalities persist in the United States and elsewhere in the world. The struggle to fully realize the ideals of the Declaration remains a work in progress. As we reflect on the Declaration of Independence, it is important to recognize both its triumphs and its limitations. It was a revolutionary document for its time, challenging the norms of monarchical power and establishing enduring principles of liberty and self-government. Yet, it was also a product of its time, marked by the contradictions of slavery and the exclusion of many groups from the promise of equality. Today, the Declaration of Independence remains a powerful symbol of the human quest for freedom and dignity. His words continue to resonate, reminding us of the ideals worth fighting for and the importance of standing up for the rights of all. Curiosities and specific details. The Book of Grievances. The long list of grievances in the Declaration can be seen as a formal grievance book against King George III, detailing the ways in which the colonists believed he had violated their rights. Jefferson the reluctant writer. Although Jefferson was the primary author, he initially did not want the task, suggesting that John Adams should write it. Adams persuaded Jefferson, arguing that he was a Virginian and that Virginia should be in the forefront. The pen and ink. The signing of the Declaration did not occur all at once on July 4th. Most of the delegates signed on August 2nd, and some signed later. John Trumbull's famous painting of the signing is an artistic representation, not an accurate photograph of the event. The missing original. The signed original of the Declaration of Independence underwent several changes of location during the Revolutionary War to protect it from the British. Today, it is on display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., protected from light and moisture to preserve its fragile condition. The Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell, one of the most iconic symbols of American independence, was located in Independence Hall, then known as the Pennsylvania State House, and may have rung to announce the adoption of the Declaration on July 4, 1776. Philosophical influences. In addition to John Locke, Other Enlightenment figures such as Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau influenced the ideas behind the Declaration. The pursuit of happiness, replacing property with the pursuit of happiness, was a significant shift from Locke and reflected the American view of opportunity and self-fulfillment. International reactions. The Declaration of Independence was met with mixed reactions in Europe. Some saw Americans as rebels, while others sympathized with their quest for freedom. The Declaration and slavery, as mentioned earlier, Jefferson's omission of criticism of slavery was a political concession that tarnished the ideals of the Declaration from the beginning. Copies and distribution. After adoption, printed copies of the Declaration, known as Dunlap broadsides, were quickly distributed throughout the colonies to inform the public of Congress's decision. We've come to the end of our deep dive into the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Together, we've walked the path from the seeds of colonial discord planted by unfair taxes and lack of representation to the roar of revolution in Lexington and Concord. We've seen the power of Thomas Paine's ideas and common sense, and the courage of the men who gathered in Philadelphia to forge a new destiny. We've explored the beauty and power of Thomas Jefferson's words, which proclaimed the inalienable truth that all men are created equal, and the decades of struggle that followed to bring that truth to fruition. The Declaration of Independence is not just a historical document. It is a beacon of freedom and human rights that continues to inspire the world. It reminds us that the quest for equality and self-determination is an ongoing journey, a promise we must strive to fulfill with each generation. If you've been inspired by this story of bravery and idealism, please like this video so more people can experience it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next historical explorations, and activate the bell to be notified. And if you're really curious, click on the video that appears on the screen now to continue your journey with us. Thank you very much for joining us on this journey through time. I hope this story has touched you as much as it fascinates me. Until the next adventure.